Okay, let's unpack this. Think about a leader who didn't just face, the devastating personal illness, but also had to steer a whole nation through, well, its absolute darkest times. We're talking the Great Depression, then World War II. And somehow, he didn't just manage it, he fundamentally reshaped the country's future. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the, frankly, extraordinary life and presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR, I mean, his impact on modern America, on the world stage, it's just immense. You really can't overstate it. So our mission today really is to explore how all these pieces fit together. His unique background, those really deep personal struggles he went through, and this incredibly pragmatic vision he had. How did all that lead to these monumental changes? Things like the New Deal, obviously, and America stepping up, taking this pivotal role in World War II, a role that, let's be honest, felt pretty much unavoidable by then. We'll be drawing on, well, quite a lot of material, biographical bits, historical analysis, even contemporary accounts, just trying to pinpoint those key moments, those decisions that defined his time and, still echo today.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, isn't just the list of historical facts, the dates and the acts, is how deeply his personal journey was woven into the nation's story. Almost inseparable, really. If you connect that to the bigger picture, you start to see how his responses to crisis, both his own health crisis and the nation's economic and military ones, how they keep resonating. In policy, sure, but also in leadership styles, even in how we think about what government should do. His story isn't just history locked in the past. It's this profound study in resilience and smart governance and maybe how individual character can shape, well, everyone's destiny in ways you don't always expect.
Exactly. So whether you're curious about where our modern social safety nets actually came from, or you want to grasp the true scale of the Great Depression, or maybe how America went from being pretty isolationist to a global leader, well, this deep dive, we hope, will give you a really solid, thorough understanding of why FDR is still such a crucial figure to understand. So let's journey back right to the beginning. His formative years, which might seem a world away from the massive struggles he'd face later on. Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He entered the world January 30th, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York. And right from that first moment, he was born into this world of, well, immense privilege. We were talking about an elite family deeply rooted in American history. His mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, she came from a really wealthy, influential line, connections to the China trade, that sort of thing. And his father, James Roosevelt, was a successful businessman himself, railroad vice president, landowner, comfort, stability, it was all there.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just recent wealth. This was old money, heritage. The family roots went way back to the earliest Dutch and English colonial elite here in America. So yes, this environment gave him incredible opportunities right from the start, no question. But, it also came with these significant expectations, heavy responsibilities, frankly. It sets up this really interesting dynamic, doesn't it? You have this man from the pinnacle of privilege, steeped in these aristocratic traditions, who later becomes the champion for these sweeping social welfare programs that really challenge the whole economic status quo, that family background, that deep connection to American history. It definitely shaped him, gave him this natural confidence, maybe a sense of noblesse oblige, that idea that privilege comes with a duty to act responsibly, and it undoubtedly played a role in his later political career, kind of laid the groundwork for a life aimed at public service.
That's a really crucial point. You picture this almost idyllic upbringing, European tours, private tutors, horses.
Mm.
It seems so far removed from the gritty realities he'd confront later. It's like he was nurtured in this, I don't know, cocoon of comfort before being thrown into the world's really harsh struggles. And that preparation, as you said, it was thorough, especially the education part.
Oh, absolutely. Top-tier education.
Yeah.
The best institutions available at the time. And it wasn't just about academics. It was very much about building character, instilling a kind of moral fortitude.
Right. He started at Groton, a very highly regarded boarding school, known for being rigorous academically, but also, and this is key, for emphasizing Christian ethics and, importantly, public service. Our sources really highlight that Groton wasn't just about learning facts. It aimed to instill both academic excellence and this strong moral discipline, this sense of duty to serve the community, serve the nation. You can see how the school's strictness, its ideals, left a really deep mark on him, kind of laid down those tracks for the leadership qualities he showed later. It hammered home that idea, privilege equals duty, a concept that, well, you see driving some pretty radical government moves later on.
Definitely. And after Groton, he went to Harvard, studied history, political science. And those years They were really crucial for shaping his political thinking. The reading suggests he was soaking up these liberal, progressive ideas that were really gaining momentum then. Industrialization was throwing up all these new social economic challenges. But importantly, he didn't just throw out the past. He stayed committed to American traditions, constitutional values. And that combination, embracing progressive change while respecting history and institutions, that became a real hallmark of his approach later, allowed him to be both a reformer, sometimes quite radical, and also a constitutionalist. He was wrestling with the big ideas of his time, moving beyond maybe the more conservative world he grew up in.
So he's processing all these new ideas, these progressive philosophies, but still anchored in those core American values he learned growing up. That's quite a mix. He even started law school at Columbia, but then, well, politics called. He pivoted to a political career before even finishing his law degree, drawn more to public service, it seems. It's striking, though, thinking about that very aristocratic, maybe even insulated upbringing. How did that world prepare him rather than detach him from the really raw realities of a nation in crisis later on?
It's a great question, and it's kind of paradoxical, isn't it?
Mm.
Because you'd think that privilege would create distance. But that Groton education, with its strong emphasis on noblesse oblige, that idea that privilege demands responsibility,
Huh.
well, that wasn't just theory for him. Especially after he battled polio himself, it became this deeply personal thing. It transformed, I think, abstract privilege into a real, concrete drive for public service, maybe rooted in a shared sense of human vulnerability he hadn't experienced before. Plus, his education gave him the tools to analyze history, analyze governance from a very rigorous standpoint, essential skills for crafting something as complex as the New Deal. So, while it was elite, it instilled this deep belief in civic duty, in serving the greater good, which he then applied on this massive national scale.
Okay, so after the education piece, his personal life takes a major step. 1905, he marries Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, she was also a Roosevelt, distant cousin, actually.
Roosevelt's niece, in fact.
Right, but she very quickly became this incredibly powerful political and social force entirely in her own right, not just Mrs. Roosevelt.
Well, absolutely. That marriage was hugely significant for Franklin, not just personally, but politically, too. Eleanor's deep involvement in social reform and human rights. It wasn't just her separate thing. It actively reinforced and, frankly, pushed Franklin's own political vision. She wasn't just a partner. She was a political powerhouse, a really sharp observer of injustice, a tireless advocate for people who didn't have a voice. She definitely pushed him towards more progressive positions. Her activism, her willingness to travel constantly, especially later when his mobility was gone, her direct connections with all sorts of communities, that gave Franklin invaluable insights. A ground-level view of what ordinary Americans were facing. She became his eyes and ears, didn't she? Bringing the reality of unemployment, the struggles of minorities, women's issues, right to his attention. It broadened his perspective enormously.
Sounds like a real dynamic duo, politically and personally, a force for change. So, his own political career kicks off in 1910. He gets elected to the New York State Senate. And right away, he's focusing on progressive policies, social reforms. This gave him firsthand experience with the kind of economic, social, political problems the country was grappling with then. He wasn't just watching, he jumped right in, made a name for himself pretty quickly as a bit of a young maverick.
He really did. And that early exposure to state-level politics was just invaluable. He quickly got known for being independent, famously taking on Tammany Hall, the big Democratic machine in New York. That was bold for a newcomer. Our sources show him really focusing on fighting corruption, inefficiency in city and state government. He started developing this quite comprehensive vision for New York's economy and social structure, thinking systemically, not just about small fixes. That time in the state Senate, it let him sharpen his legislative skills, build that reformer reputation, and learn the very tricky art of political negotiation.
But then, that upward trajectory, where he's really making his mark, it just comes to a sudden, brutal halt. August 1921. He's vacationing at Campobello Island, and he contracts polio. This illness, it left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down, dependent on a wheelchair. A profound personal tragedy, obviously, and one that looked like it would absolutely end his political career right there.
And the sources really emphasize this physical disability created huge challenges, personally and politically. You have to remember the context, the attitudes, the lack of accessibility back then. His limited mobility often had to be, well, carefully managed, hidden from the public eye. There was this prevailing idea that a leader with a physical impairment might be seen as weak, unable to handle the job. But instead of just retreating, Roosevelt's sheer determination, his incredible willpower just wouldn't let him give up. He poured himself into grueling physical therapy, yes, but also into this immense mental battle to reclaim his life and his future.
Despite that enormous physical challenge, his resilience was just extraordinary. He absolutely refused to let polio define what he could achieve. And this is where, as you said, his personal story really merges with his political one. It showed this unbreakable spirit that people would later desperately need to see in their leader during those huge national crises. Many historians argue, and I think it makes sense, that struggling with polio actually deepened his character, it didn't just hinder him.
Precisely. Overcoming those challenges, it arguably made him a stronger leader, a more empathetic one. And it really does raise that question for us, doesn't it? How did that profound personal adversity, that daily struggle, shape his empathy, his resolve, especially when leading a nation through its own collective crisis? It's often described as a crucible, forging a deeper understanding of struggle, a stronger commitment to overcoming obstacles. It taught him patience, perseverance, and maybe, just maybe, a new way to connect with the suffering of others, a shared vulnerability that kind of cut through that privileged background. Polio didn't stop him. Paradoxically, it seems to have made him even more determined, sharpened his inner strength, maybe connected him to the human condition in a way nothing else could have.
Okay, so picking up that political thread again, his journey really starts gaining serious traction with that first big step getting elected to the New York State Senate back in 1910. And like we said, it wasn't just about holding the seat. He dove straight into progressive policy, advocating for things like labor rights, social justice, economic reforms. He wasn't afraid to challenge the established powers right from the get-go, championing things like direct primaries, trying to limit child labor, really making waves early on.
He certainly wasn't shy. And those sources show his early focus was often on tackling corruption and inefficiency. Taking on Tammany Hall, the entrenched Democratic machine that was quite audacious for a freshman senator, he started developing this really quite comprehensive vision for New York's economy, its social fabric, already thinking about systemic change, not just tinkering around the edges. That time in the state Senate was crucial. It let him hone his legislative abilities, figure out the complex machinery of state government, and really build that reputation as a formidable reformer.
Then, 1913, a huge leap. He lands on the national stage, appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President Woodrow Wilson. That brought him significant national visibility, exposed him to how the federal government really worked. And it was a critical time, too, with World War I looming and then breaking out. He was directly involved in managing the war effort from the Navy's perspective, modernizing the fleet, overseeing massive shipbuilding programs, handling logistics.
An incredibly formative role for him, absolutely. It gave him deep knowledge, real hands-on experience in national security, foreign policy areas that would become absolutely central later in his own presidency. He was a strong advocate for beefing up the American Navy, for modernizing military strategy, showed an early grasp of geopolitics, the need for strong defense. Plus, he learned how to navigate complex bureaucracies, manage huge budgets, lead large organizations, all under the intense pressure of a world war.
Yeah, that seems like such a crucial preparation for what came later. It's fascinating, isn't it? How a job that sounds like it's about ships and supplies actually sharpened his strategic thinking, gave him practical experience in large-scale administration during wartime. He wasn't just pushing papers. He was right there in critical decision-making that shaped naval power and foreign policy. A really intense training ground for a future commander-in-chief, giving him insights into how federal power actually works.
Absolutely. And being Assistant Secretary of the Navy under a progressive president like Wilson, that also exposed him to the big picture of international relations, the massive complexities of wartime logistics, resource allocation. He saw firsthand the immense power and the responsibility that came with national leadership during a global crisis. That experience, priceless when he faced an even bigger global conflict 2 decades later. He built relationships with key military figures, got a deep understanding of military-industrial mobilization.
Okay, moving ahead to 1920. He gets tapped as the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket with James M. Cox. They didn't win the election, but still, a major step. Put him firmly on the national map, gave him national campaign experience. You could see it as a setback, sure, a disappointment. But his drive, it just didn't falter. In fact, those years really cemented his experience in public administration, in politics, even while he was starting that incredibly tough personal battle.
Indeed. Then came the polio diagnosis in 21, bringing that major physical disability, forcing him into that period of intense personal struggle, physical recovery, and the sources really stress this. Despite needing the wheelchair, despite often having to use clever staging, leaning on aids, using braces, careful photo ops to downplay his limited mobility in public, he overcame those physical hurdles with just remarkable political determination and charisma. He spent years doing relentless physical therapy, building upper body strength, especially down at Warm Springs, Georgia. He even helped transform that place into a major polio rehabilitation center.
And he wasn't doing it alone. The sources really emphasize how critical his family, especially Eleanor, was during this time. While he was recovering, strategizing his comeback, Eleanor became his vital link to the outside political and social world. She traveled constantly, spoke for him, went to conferences, reported back everything she saw and heard across the country.
Her own deep involvement in social reform, poverty, labor rights, civil rights that actually strengthened Franklin's political positions. It gave him an even deeper connection, maybe, to the struggles of ordinary people. She truly was his eyes and ears, keeping him plugged into the nation's social pulse while he was focused on his physical recovery. Her advocacy broadened his progressive views, kept him grounded in the human side of policy. That period, it wasn't a retreat. It was this time of intense personal and political rethinking, deepening his understanding of vulnerability and also resilience.
Right.
Let's fast forward a bit to the early 1930s. The Great Depression hits. And this becomes the undeniable, the absolute turning point in Roosevelt's political career. The 29 crash just spiraled. By 32, unemployment was maybe 25%. Banks were failing left and right, thousands of them, farmers ruined. Just this pervasive despair gripping the entire country. People were literally starving, living in these makeshift shanty towns they called Hoovervilles, losing all faith in the system. The whole nation felt like it was collapsing, just desperate for leadership or any kind of hope. And in that unprecedented chaos, Roosevelt zeroed in precisely on social justice, on economic regulation, and on a dramatic expansion of the government's role in the economy. He wasn't just offering vague promises. He was proposing bold, concrete actions to a population that was absolutely desperate, a clear alternative to the hands-off, laissez-faire approach that had prevailed and, arguably, made things worse. He spoke directly to people's fears, their anxieties, and he promised action.
So when he gets the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, he builds his whole campaign around these issues.
Yeah.
Famously saying in his acceptance speech, "I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." That vision, packaged under that incredibly powerful slogan, New Deal, wasn't just about fixing the immediate crisis. It aimed to fundamentally change America's economic and social structure, make it more secure, more equitable. It was this huge, sweeping promise to a nation that was truly on its knees. And boy, did it resonate.
It absolutely did. It was a lifeline. It offered hope where there seemed to be none left.
Yeah.
And it proposed this radical break from the policies that had so clearly failed. The stage was completely set for a monumental shift in American government, a total redefinition of a relationship between the government and its people, and the start of a new era where the federal government took responsibility for national welfare.
So Roosevelt wins the election, takes office in 1933, and that moment, it really was a critical turning point in American history. It marked this seismic shift in what people expected from their government. Before him, the Hoover administration had largely stuck to this idea of limited government intervention, right? Believing the economy would fix itself, that direct federal help would somehow weaken people's initiative. And the result was, well, the Depression just got deeper and deeper. Previous presidents had really hesitated about major state intervention. People were desperate for something different, anything different. And FDR promised exactly that, action. He absolutely did. During the campaign, he'd clearly stated that robust government action was necessary. And he didn't wait. As soon as he took office, he launched into implementing these comprehensive reforms. This wasn't just a routine political win. It was a clear mandate from the people for a radically different approach to government's role. And what's really striking is how ready the public was to embrace such a profound philosophical change, given the depth of the crisis. The old ways had failed spectacularly. People weren't just open to a new vision of government, they were demanding it. His inaugural address, with that famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," it perfectly captured the mood and set this immediate tone of determined action.
And that new vision took shape as the New Deal. That was the umbrella term for all these multifaceted economic policies. It boiled down to three main goals. Very clear, very interconnected. Relief, recovery, and reform. The three R's. Not just buzzwords. These were the pillars for rebuilding the nation. Right. Let's break those down a bit. Relief was about immediate help. Getting aid directly to people who were in desperate need, food, money, emergency jobs to address the awful poverty and suffering. Just stopping the bleeding. Recovery was aimed at getting the economy back on its feet, reviving industries, helping agriculture, trying to stimulate demand, get things moving again. And reform, maybe the most crucial in the long run, was about fixing the system itself,
Yeah.
making it fairer, more stable, so a disaster like this couldn't happen again. Fundamentally changing government's role in the economy and society.
And he didn't waste a single second. That first phase, the legendary first 100 days, was just this incredible whirlwind of legislative action, unprecedented speed. I mean, within days of taking office, he tackled the banking crisis head-on, declared a nationwide bank holiday, closing every bank temporarily, a hugely bold move to just stop the panic, let federal officials check the books, stabilize the solvent ones before they reopen.
It was absolutely crucial. Instantly calmed things down, restored a sense of control. And right after that came the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. This guaranteed individual bank deposits up to a certain amount. That simple act restored people's confidence in banks almost overnight. It ended those terrifying bank runs that had wiped out so many people's life savings and paralyzed the whole financial system. This policy was critical. It resolved the crisis of trust that had just crippled the economy. It sent a clear message: the government stands behind your money. It fundamentally changed banking for the average person, made it feel safe again.
He also went right at the crisis in farming with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. The idea here was to provide state support, basically paying farmers not to grow certain crops, things like cotton, wheat, corn, or raise too much livestock. The goal was to reduce the huge surpluses that were crushing prices and driving farmers off their land. It brought some much-needed stability back to the agricultural sector, which had been suffering from overproduction and rock-bottom prices since World War I ended.
And then there was unemployment, maybe the most visible agony of the Depression. Millions out of work. So he launched these massive public works programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, put young men to work on conservation projects, planting trees, building trails, improving parks. And the Public Works Administration, the PWA, handled bigger projects, building dams, bridges, schools, hospitals. These weren't just make-work jobs. They provided paychecks to millions, yes, but they also invested heavily in the nation's infrastructure. Tangible improvements people could see. It gave people not just money, but a sense of purpose, dignity, after being jobless for so long. It was the government visibly working for its citizens.
So what's the big takeaway here? In this time of just utter despair and chaos, FDR delivered a concrete plan. Immediate, tangible action. Not just speeches. He offered hope through changes people could actually see and feel in their communities. These initiatives were incredibly bold for their time, a complete break from past government inaction. And they fundamentally changed how people saw government, what it could do, what it should do. He showed this decisiveness, this willingness to experiment that the country was absolutely desperate for.
And perhaps the most lasting legacy of the New Deal, a real cornerstone of modern America, is the Social Security Act, passed in 1935. This established a permanent, comprehensive social welfare system. It covered old age insurance pensions, plus unemployment insurance, and benefits for the disabled. It was truly revolutionary because for the very first time, the federal government took direct responsibility for providing a safety net against the economic hazards of life, old age, job loss, disability.
And this wasn't just a temporary fix for the Depression, was it? This fundamentally changed the relationship between Americans and their government, guaranteed a basic level of economic security.
Absolutely not temporary. This became concrete proof that the state could and would play an active, ongoing role in ensuring its citizens' economic security. And if you look at the bigger picture, Social Security didn't just transform the U.S., it inspired similar social welfare models all around the world. It marked this pivotal shift globally in the relationship between governments and their people. It cemented the idea that government has a responsibility to protect its vulnerable populations, to provide a floor, a basic standard of living. That was a concept that had been fiercely resisted for generations before the Depression forced the issue.
It really did redefine the social contract in America. And these New Deal reforms, they really pushed beyond the boundaries of traditional classical economics, didn't they? Boldly showing that state intervention could be effective, even necessary, during major economic crises. He basically moved away from the idea that markets would always just fix themselves.
Exactly. Our sources highlight the influence of John Maynard Keynes' economic theories here, particularly the idea that government spending could and should be used to stimulate demand during a downturn, even if it meant running deficits temporarily. This shift from relying solely on the invisible hand of the market to using the more visible hand of government intervention led to Keynesian economics becoming dominant, not just in the U.S. but globally, for decades after. And the New Deal wasn't just about macroeconomics. It also significantly boosted the rights and conditions of working people. Things like the National Labor Relations Act, often called the Wagner Act, powerfully strengthened unions, guaranteed the right to collective bargaining. And the Fair Labor Standards Act set the first national minimum wage and maximum work hours. These directly empowered labor movements gave workers unprecedented protections.
This really shows a huge paradigm shift in economic thinking, a fundamental change in how the economy was viewed, how it was managed. It's fascinating, isn't it? How a crisis can just accelerate the adoption of brand new ideas, and then those ideas reshape society for decades, affecting everything from economic policy to labor rights. It wasn't just about getting through the Depression, it was about fundamentally changing how we thought about the economy and government's role in it.
But it's really important to remember, the New Deal was not universally popular. It faced intense criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. Conservatives naturally thought Roosevelt's level of state intervention was way too excessive. They argued it choked free markets, ballooned the national debt, created this overreaching, almost dictatorial federal government. They hated programs like the AAA for, paying farmers to destroy crops when people were hungry. And they saw his attempt to expand the Supreme Court, the court packing scheme, as a dangerous assault on the separation of powers.
And then from the other side, from the left, you had figures arguing the reforms didn't go nearly far enough. They wanted more fundamental systemic change, maybe even towards socialism. People like Huey Long with his Share Our Wealth plan, or Father Charles Coughlin, the influential radio priest, they argued FDR was just putting a Band-Aid on capitalism, that he hadn't done enough to redistribute wealth and really challenge corporate power.
Absolutely. And these fierce debates, they really laid the foundation for the deep ideological divides we still see in American politics today. Arguments about the proper size and role of government, about welfare programs, economic regulation. They echo these New Deal fights. It brings up that fundamental question, doesn't it? How do you balance necessary government action in a crisis with legitimate concerns about government overreach and individual liberty? The debates sparked by the New Deal about government's role, the balance between freedom and security, they continue to shape our political discourse right now, influencing arguments about everything from healthcare to climate change policy. It was a foundational argument about what America should be, and we're still having it.
Okay, so beyond completely reshaping America domestically, Roosevelt's presidency also had this massive, unavoidable impact on world history, particularly through his leadership during World War II. Now, back in the 1930s, you had fascism and totalitarianism just surging. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Imperial Japan expanding aggressively in Asia. The U.S. response initially was pretty strict neutrality. There was this very strong isolationist feeling after the trauma and disillusionment of World War I.
Right. But Roosevelt, he was watching these international developments very closely. He saw the rising threat, recognized that these aggressive regimes weren't just a European problem, but an existential danger to democracy everywhere, and ultimately to American security itself. So he started to subtly, carefully, but definitely redefine America's role in the world. He knew the U.S. couldn't stay isolated forever, even though public opinion was still largely resistant to getting involved in another foreign war. He began the slow process of preparing the country, politically and militarily, despite those risks.
So, when war finally breaks out in Europe, September 1939, Germany invades Poland. Roosevelt, even with that strong anti-war sentiment in Congress and among the public, starts advocating for ways to help the Allies. He famously positioned the U.S. as the arsenal of democracy, finding ways to provide critical support without immediately sending American soldiers into the fight. It was a really delicate balancing act, wasn't it? Navigating public opinion versus strategic necessity.
It absolutely was. And the key mechanism he devised was the groundbreaking Lend-Lease Act, passed in March of '41. This allowed the U.S. to provide huge amounts of military and economic aid, ships, planes, food, fields to Britain, and later the Soviet Union and other allied nations. The idea was they'd return or pay for it after the war. What's really fascinating about Lend-Lease is how significant it was before the U.S. even officially entered the war. It basically bypassed the old neutrality acts and let America materially support the countries fighting the Axis powers. It was strategically brilliant, a clever way to bolster the Allies, prepare for potential U.S. involvement, but still maintain that official neutrality for a public that was deeply wary of another European entanglement. It was a major turning point, signaling America's growing commitment.
But that official neutrality, that semblance of staying out, it ended violently and suddenly. December 7th, 1941, the surprise Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. That brought America into the war instantly and unequivocally. It was a devastating attack, over 2,400 Americans killed, much of the Pacific Fleet damaged or destroyed. But it also did something else. It completely unified a previously divided nation.
Roosevelt's response was immediate and powerful. The very next day, he delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to Congress, asking for a declaration of war. It was just a masterclass in rallying a shocked and angered public. He framed the attack perfectly as this unprovoked, treacherous act. It galvanized the nation, uniting almost everyone behind the war effort, effectively silencing the remaining isolationist voices overnight. He tapped right into the American sense of justice and resolve.
So, once the U.S. is fully in the war, Roosevelt immediately starts making these huge strategic decisions, coordinating efforts across both the European and Pacific theaters. He understood this was a truly global conflict, needing unprecedented cooperation between allies who, let's face it, didn't always trust each other.
Right. He was in constant communication with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and, crucially, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. They formed the Big Three alliance. Managing that relationship, especially with Stalin, required immense diplomatic skill, navigating deep ideological differences and competing national interests. But Roosevelt was central to holding that vital alliance together. And you see his focus not just on winning the war, but on shaping the peace afterwards. In major wartime conferences, like the Cairo Conference in '43, with Churchill and China's Chiang Kai-shek planning the Pacific strategy, and especially the Yalta Conference in February '45, just months before he died. Yalta was where they tackled the really big, tough questions about the post-war world: how to divide Germany, the structure of the new United Nations organization, something Roosevelt passionately believed in, and the incredibly contentious issue of the future of Eastern Europe.
He genuinely believed that international cooperation was the only way to prevent another global catastrophe like this one. He really pushed hard to create new structures like the UN to maintain peace. This pioneering approach, it fundamentally shifted American foreign policy away from isolationism towards active global engagement. It laid the groundwork for multilateral diplomacy even before the Cold War really set in. It really speaks to his foresight, doesn't it? Recognizing that collective security was the only path forward after such devastation.
Absolutely. And while all this intense military and diplomatic leadership was happening, Roosevelt was also overseeing this incredible economic transformation at home. War production ramped up to levels never seen before. Our sources really emphasized that the massive mobilization of American industry and labor was the decisive factor in finally ending the Great Depression. Unemployment basically vanished as factories went into overdrive. If you connect that to the bigger picture, the war wasn't just a military struggle. It acted as this enormous economic engine. It definitively pulled the U.S. out of the Depression, and at the same time, it triggered these major social shifts that would have repercussions for decades.
Oh, definitely. The sheer demand for labor during the war pulled millions of women into the workforce, into jobs they'd never held before. Rosie the Riveter, right? And it also opened up new, though often still unequal, opportunities for African Americans and other minorities, particularly with migration to northern industrial cities for factory jobs. These changes challenged traditional roles, planted seeds for future civil rights movements.
It's exactly. The demands of total war forced this complete reorganization of the American economy and workforce. It unleashed productive power that had been lying dormant through the Depression years. And that massive output, that industrial might, solidified the U.S. as the dominant economic powerhouse on the global stage, positioning it perfectly for the post-war era. You could say the foundations of post-war American prosperity, the rise of the middle class, were very much built during that period of intense wartime mobilization.
You know, thinking about the man himself, Franklin Roosevelt spent decades really dealing with the severe physical effects of polio. Constant pain sometimes, the reliance on leg braces, crutches, that wheelchair. It was this ongoing personal battle for mobility, for independence. Yet, despite all that, he somehow managed to project this image of strength, of vitality, of absolute capability to the public. He very carefully managed how he was seen.
Right, because his limited mobility, his dependence on the wheelchair, could easily have been seen as a major weakness back then. Remember, this was a time when physical strength was often visually equated with leadership ability. So yeah, his condition was often quite deliberately concealed. Newsreels, photographs that were carefully staged to show him standing, maybe leaning on a podium, or supported by his sons or aides. Minimizing the visual evidence of his disability was definitely part of the strategy. But Roosevelt, he somehow transcended that physical limitation through just sheer force of will, determination, and this incredible, almost magnetic charisma. He managed to turn what could have been a crippling liability into, weirdly, an element of his strength. His personal struggle, I think, became this source of quiet inspiration for a nation facing its own immense struggles. It showed his incredible resolve, his capacity to overcome huge adversity. He knew what it felt like to fight back from the brink.
Yeah, that's where his personal story just becomes completely intertwined with his political leadership. It showed that indomitable spirit, that resilience that people so desperately needed to see in their leader during the Depression and then again during the war. His leadership style, it wasn't just about policy papers. It was this unique blend of being decisive in a crisis, being incredibly pragmatic, and having these absolutely masterful communication skills that connected him directly with ordinary Americans in a way no president really had before.
He really did revolutionize presidential communication. Instead of just relying on formal speeches or newspaper reports, he pioneered the use of radio to speak directly to the public. Those broadcasts, the famous fireside chats, they were absolutely crucial for building confidence, for restoring hope during very dark times. And what's really striking is just how innovative and effective that was back then, before television. He'd speak in this calm, clear, reassuring way, explaining really complex issues like why the banks were closed or what was happening in the war in simple terms, almost like he was a guest right there in your living room.
It was a total game changer. I mean, think about that first fireside chat, March 1933. He calmly explained the whole bank holiday situation, told people what to expect when banks reopened, assured them their money would be safe. And that simple, direct explanation, delivered in that warm, empathetic tone, it worked. It restored public trust almost immediately, helped end those devastating bank runs. It let him bypass the often critical newspapers and forge this personal connection with millions. He wasn't just talking at them, it felt like he was talking with them.
Exactly. And beyond that resolve, beyond the communication genius, Roosevelt was also just fundamentally pragmatic. He was flexible, not rigidly stuck to any single ideology. People often described him as willing to experiment, to try something, and if it didn't work, try something else. A political chameleon almost.
Yeah, the sources make that clear. He wasn't afraid to compromise to get things done, especially to get the support of different groups, even within his own Democratic Party, which was this really broad, sometimes unwieldy coalition, right? Southern conservatives, Northern liberals, labor unions, farmers, all under one tent. He somehow managed to balance these often competing interests, hold that coalition together, which was absolutely essential for passing all that ambitious New Deal legislation. He knew when to push, when to compromise, when to stand firm, when to maybe concede a smaller point to win the bigger battle. It showed he wasn't just this charismatic figurehead. He was a really shrewd, strategic politician, masterful at navigating the complex political landscape, building consensus where it seemed impossible.
He was definitely a master of the art of the possible. You know, when the Supreme Court started striking down parts of the early New Deal, he didn't just give up. He adapted his approach. He even tried that very controversial court packing plan. It failed, but it showed his relentless determination to achieve his goals. It was that combination, the visionary leadership, the powerful communication, and that deeply pragmatic political skill that made him so incredibly effective. It allowed him to lead the nation through not one but two unprecedented national crises.
So what's the bottom line there? He wasn't just a dreamer with big ideas. He was a master navigator of the political system. He understood that compromise, adaptability were crucial for making progress. He knew how to use the levers of power, how to rally public opinion to achieve his goals, even when facing huge opposition. That fusion of ideals and pragmatism, that's what allowed him to fundamentally reshape the country. When you look back, Franklin D. Roosevelt is consistently ranked as one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century, not just in the U.S., but globally. His impact was just enormous. Domestically, those New Deal policies, they didn't just provide temporary relief during the Depression, they laid the actual foundation for the modern American welfare state. And they powerfully demonstrated that government intervention could be important, even essential, during major economic crises.
Absolutely. Things we almost take for granted now. Social security, strong protections for workers' rights, large-scale public investments in infrastructure. These fundamentally changed the social and economic structure of the U.S. These weren't just short-term fixes, they were permanent structural changes. They redefined the relationship between the government and its citizens, establishing this principle that the government have a role of responsibility to ensure a basic level of economic well-being for its people. That safety net they created still supports millions of Americans today.
And then on the world stage in foreign policy, Roosevelt oversaw this incredible transformation of the U.S. From a nation largely focused inward, pretty isolationist, wary of foreign entanglements, into a genuine global superpower, ready and willing to take a leading role. His leadership was obviously decisive in winning World War II. And his crucial role in shaping the post-war world order, things like the UN that elevated the U.S. to this central, really dominant position in international relations, a position it's largely maintained ever since.
He really spearheaded the creation of the United Nations. He had this vision of an organization where countries could work out their differences peacefully. He championed this multilateral approach to diplomacy, a big shift away from just going it alone. And if you connect that to the bigger picture today, his vision for international cooperation after that devastating war, it fundamentally reshaped global governance and America's place within it. It really raises that question. How much of our current global order, the UN itself, institutions like the World Bank, even alliances like NATO that came later, can still be traced back directly to his influence, to the groundwork laid during and immediately after the war? You could argue his foresight built the foundations for the modern liberal international order.
His legacy is just left these incredibly deep marks on American political culture, on world politics, marks we still see, still debate today. His approach to crisis management, his mastery of public communication, those groundbreaking social policies, they're still studied as examples of leadership all over the world, in political science, in history classes.
Yeah, and our sources point out, even today, when countries face severe economic crises, they often look back to Roosevelt's policies, to the New Deal for inspiration, as a potential blueprint for how government can intervene effectively. His ability to restore hope, to enact sweeping change under immense pressure, it remains this really compelling model for leaders who are grappling with complex challenges in our own interconnected, often turbulent world. The ongoing debates we have now about Social Security's future, about government spending levels, about America's role in the world in many ways, they're just continuations of the conversations that FDR started 89 years ago.
So what does it all mean? FDR wasn't just a leader for his specific time. His life, his career, they continue to be the fundamental reference point for how we think about state governance, about social policy, about international relations. His impact is just woven right into the fabric of modern America and the global community, too. So today, we've really tried to unpack how Franklin D. Roosevelt, born to immense privilege, yet faced with profound personal adversity and a nation just drowning in despair, became the architect of modern America. From those truly transformative New Deal policies that created our social safety net, reshaped the role of government itself, all the way to his decisive global leadership that helped rescue democracy and reshape the entire world order during World War II. His story is just one of immense impact and an enduring legacy that still touches all of our lives.
And maybe this raises an important question for you listening right now. When you consider the sheer scale of the crises Roosevelt confronted, that shattered economy, a world engulfed in war, plus those immense personal challenges, being confined to a wheelchair, what qualities do you think were the most essential for his success? And maybe more importantly, how might those qualities, that unique blend of pragmatism, empathy, communication skill, sheer willpower, how might those still apply to the kind of leadership we need in our own complex, often difficult world today?
Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep deep diving into the issues that matter for you. We really hope this deep dive has given you a powerful shortcut to being well informed on this truly pivotal figure, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.